Good morning and welcome to Woodland Fitness. So, last week we talked a little bit about progressive overload, and I kind of wanted to keep going down that direction. I'll talk a little bit more about how I would put together a program, kind of just general broad strokes, nothing super specific, to kind of give you an idea of if you're trying to get a good idea of whether or not the program you're on right now is a good fit, or if you're trying to get an idea of how you should build your own program. I just wanted to throw a few ideas out there and kind of explain how I normally put together a program. One of the big things that I focus on are compound lifts. What a compound lift is a movement that requires multiple muscle groups to complete the movement. A really good example would be a squat or a deadlift. When you ask someone what you're working out with a deadlift, you can't give a straight specific answer because you're working the whole posterior chain, but then you're also working your forearms, your core. There are multiple muscles involved in this movement. When you're talking about a squat, it's the same thing, because even though it's leg focused, your back is still getting work because it's maintaining the weight above you. And for some people, depending on how much weight that is, that's a lot more work than you think. So usually when I'm starting to build a program, I start out with a few compound lifts. I like to focus on a couple for each body group. So for legs, you usually do something that's a little more quad focused, and then one that's a little more hamstring focused. For me, it's usually a squat and deadlift variation for one of those two. And then for presses, I'm looking for a horizontal press and then a vertical press. For the back, I'm looking for a horizontal row and a vertical row. And then on top of that, I like to include a rotational movement because I think it's important to practice maintaining stability of your core and the rest of your body while you're in some kind of rotation. And that's not something we practice a whole lot in certain programs. I like to include rotational movements though. And so once you've got these typically 6 compound lifts, there are multiple different ways that you can split this up. One of the ways that I've done it before is for the 7 days of the week, I did 1 compound lift and 1 isolation movement, which I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. And that was all I did for that day. So that took me 15, 20 minutes, depending on setup. And that is a great way to bring your workout down to 15, 20 minutes if that's what you need. Or you can use those movements as a basis for a full body day, a push-pull legs program, even a bro split. You can manage to fit all of those in. So after I've picked out my compound movements and the rotational movement that I want to use, what I look at next are where I see mobility issues. Most common ones I see are shoulder mobility, whether it's being able to raise your arm straight up above your head, or ankle mobility, being able to get all the way down into a fully stretched position without your heel or toes coming up. Hip mobility is always a big one. People struggle to get down into a squat or struggle to do all kinds of different movements. And I take a movement movement or two, kind of just depends on what style program you're putting together, how much time you have for each of these. And I focus that movement on those mobility issues. Good example would be if you've got shoulder mobility, where you're doing some kind of face pull, some kind of rear delt fly to help build up the rotator joint. We're doing some kind of military press, is that vertical press, so that we can work on getting that full extension overhead. And I want to have a movement where we're not just increasing the mobility, but we're also increasing strength as we're increasing mobility. So we've got this extended range of motion now, and we want to get strong in it too, so that it becomes our range of motion. So once I've picked out things based on instability, whether it's from surgery or whether it's from just not being able to do the movement in general, if you notice that there's some kind of, I keep doing the overhead because that is one that I see very often where you can't bring your arm fully up overhead. And it's also very easy for me to demonstrate on camera. But if you have a movement that you know you struggle with, then we're going to build an exercise based on that movement. And then after that, we're going to go to isolation movements, where for this, again, it depends on how much time you have. I want to focus on areas that we're missing with the compound lifts, because while these do cover a lot of our muscle groups, every once in a while we're still going to miss a few smaller muscles here and there, and I want to make sure that I hit those with isolation movements. And then on top of that, we're going to use isolation movements to bring up areas that we want to focus on. So if you're really wanting to focus on your back, making your back look bigger, making your back look stronger, we're going to do an isolation movement to try and help bring out the back. If you're wanting your biceps to look bigger, we're going to work on an isolation movement focused on that. Now, when I was doing the 15 to 20 minute program, the way I picked my isolation movement is I actually picked one that complemented my compound movement for the day. So if I was doing barbell rows, which is a little more lat focused, then I would pick an isolation movement that was a little more trap focused. So that way throughout the week, I was hitting every major muscle group a couple times a week. And that's kind of the gist of how I would put that together as a 15 to 20 minute program. You can rotate that in and out to put more of a focus on things that you want to bring out. If you have more time, then you can kind of add more exercises in there. And the other thing I wanted to say is that if I were to build a single day program, so you can only do 1 day a week, then I would actually just stick to those compound lifts. And if you have time, include that rotational movement. And for your 1 day a week, make sure you're hitting those compound lifts. And just focus on bringing your strength up in those. You might wind up with a little bit of instability over time, but it'll probably take a little while for you to notice that, and by then you'll be in a position where you can add more to your workout program, or you've developed a consistency enough, found enough time to be able to add more days, and then you can add a little more isolation work if you need to. Most people can build a pretty good physique even just focusing on those compound movements. Usually I stick to isolation work for instabilities, which are pretty common. Mobility issues are all over the place. There was something else I was going to say. Oh, right. I wanted to give you an idea of the rep range that I usually start with. Starting out. So when I'm working with those compound movements, usually I want to stick in a lower rep range at first. The idea is to get the form down. I don't want to spend too much time fatiguing the muscles when I'm trying to get the form down in the compound movements. I want to build a good base, especially when I'm looking at a deadlift or a squat. I want you to be very comfortable with that movement before we start adding weight. And once you're comfortable with that movement, that's exactly what I want to do. I want to start adding weight and building the strength up in that movement. I like starting with a strength focus because we're going to see a pretty large amount of progress, and that gives us more room to work with in the future. So once we've built up our strength in the beginning, we can move into the hypertrophy stuff, or if you want to work on power, we can move to those movements, but we're already at a higher workload, and so we can add more weight to that, and you'll see more progress in the future from building that original foundation. I think strength, that was such a big stutter. I think strength is the perfect way to build that foundation. Whereas usually if you build the physique first, you don't wind up with the strength that would go with what you think your physique looks like. However, if you build the strength first, it's much easier to get to that physique in the future. Plus, lifting heavy is just more fun in my opinion. And I have found a lot of progress, especially with the women that I've worked with, showing them that they are a lot stronger than they think they are. And honestly, all of the guys that I've worked with have always loved doing the heavy lifting. So that's just kind of broad strokes how I start to piece together a program. I'll go into further detail in a further episode. Until then, y'all have a great week. Bye.